My name is David Denning. I'm a professor of infectious diseases and global health at the University of Manchester. And I've recently retired as a clinical doctor looking after patients with various infectious diseases, but predominantly fungal diseases. Previously, I was the director of the National Aspergillosis Centre, which is a UK reference service for patients with complex lung problems caused by fungus aspergillus. And while I was doing that, I also set up a foundation in Geneva and UK called GAFFI, which is focused on trying to improve access to diagnostics and antifungal treatments for these complex infections throughout the world.
And today we're going to be talking about GAFFI's initiative 95-95 by 2025. So, can you give me a little bit of background on this initiative, how it came to be, and kind of your goals when creating it?
So we convened a meeting alongside one of the international AIDS meetings in Seattle in 2015 with about 60, 70 people, including people from all over the world, actually, but some Africans, some South Americans, some Asians, as well as people from the WHO and other major funding agencies to address the problem of how we're going to stop people dying of fungal disease. And one of the problems with fungal disease is that it's fairly invisible until it's too late. You have to start looking for it in at-risk patients. So examples are patients with AIDS, patients who've had a transplant, patients with really complicated lung disease, patients with leukemia, lymphoma, that sort of group of patients. And we learned that many, many countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in many parts of Asia, don't really have a diagnostic service for fungal disease. And many of them don't have any of the modern treatments for fungal disease. So we ended up writing a roadmap which included a very basic summary of how many infections there might be in the world with these problems, and also the approaches, the diagnostics and the treatments that are relevant to that. And our aspiration 10 years ago now was that 95% of the world's population would have access to these diagnostics, and 95% would have access to the relevant antifungal therapies, particularly the generic antifungal therapies that are less expensive than the more recently issued ones. And we wrote a little bit about it, and we've monitored it and done some work on it, but it's quite a complex area because there are lots of different tests. There's lots of different lab approaches to handling those tests. And the registration processes for drugs are complicated in many, many countries. For example, in South Africa, flucytosine was on the roster for approval for 5 years before they finally approved it. And yet it's a core drug for fungal meningitis in AIDS. And as you know, South Africa has the largest population of HIV patients per capita in the world. So there are some challenges to do it, but that was our aspiration. 95% of the world's population should have access to these diagnostics, to the simple, straightforward diagnostics and generic antifungal therapies.
And I know that it's been hard, these countries, but can you maybe tell us a little bit about Guatemala or Uzbekistan? I know you mentioned that in your email, kind of the progress that they've made throughout the past couple of years, or just some of the countries that have stood out to be making progress.
Sure, excellent question. So in Guatemala, we funded a small demonstration project and helped run it with about 13 centers across the country looking after patients with HIV and AIDS. And we provided the wherewithal for them to run a rapid diagnostic service for two important fungal infections which are common there, histoplasmosis and cryptococcal meningitis, in tandem with diagnostics for TB, which is also common there. And there was a courier service, there was an online portal for requesting tests and getting results from the tests, and a very rapid turnaround time. And we were able to show over a period of 3 years, with lots of training and engagement of the different clinicians in the centres and training of the lab staff, that we diagnosed many, many more fungal infections. We diagnosed fewer TB infections, and that was because they were misdiagnosed as TB when actually they were a fungus. And that the overall mortality from these late stage patients went down because they were making the correct diagnosis and giving the right treatment. And that overall reduction in mortality was 8% in basically 2.5 years. And that's a really big change if you consider, statistics you may have seen on cancer, chemotherapy, etc. An 8% change reduction in mortality in that time frame is really, really impressive, actually. So that was the idea there, was to show that if you did apply these diagnostics and you provided the results quickly and you trained the clinicians in parallel, that you could really, really make a difference. And that's what we've done. So we'd like to reproduce that in other places.